offline colloquium of this semester, and we are looking forward to bring more speakers in this offline mode of colloquium conversations. So a request to all the students and colleagues to also keep reminding the campus community that on Friday we have a slot from 2 to 3:30 where we get to listen to people. We have with us Hari Pulakkat. Hari is a science journalist, and his lecture today is titled as Pioneers of Indian Science. I'll request Anish and Hari. And the way we have structured conversation is that Anish Mokashi, my friend and colleague at School of Arts and Sciences, will have conversation with Hari on the book, Hari Pulakkat's book called Space, Life, Matter. And there's a good linguistic ambiguity there. Do you read space, life, matter with commas, or do you look at and read it as matter being the verb there? Space, life, matter. So over to you, Anish, and very warm welcome to Hari. Please come.
Hello, Hari, welcome. And I realized that I should have gotten the book here so that we could have shown you. It's a very interesting cover also, I felt. So Himanshu, last week in fact, Himanshu gave me the book and he told me about the colloquium. And I started reading the book. So I read the book last week, and this week I have been reading it on my commute actually. And it's very grippy, I would say. And I would like to say, as the title says, Space, Life, Matter, maybe Hari should explain it in more detail and we'll talk about it. But the stories about Indian science, like, which means people, right? The scientists themselves, the institutions that they worked in, and interestingly, a third element which I find is so unique about this book. The third element is about, and as an experimentalist, that's very close to my heart. The third element is about the instrumentation of, what the equipment that people worked with, how they developed it, and their struggles and so on. So it's a very grippy, many stories of within these three major themes, told in a very grippy way, without trivializing the science, I would say. Going in, that's a very, I would say that's a very tricky aspect of telling stories about science. You don't want to trivialize things and just, say something hand-waving. Neither do you want to bog down people with so many details that they are not able to make sense of, what are we talking about. So I think that's a great achievement, I would say, for Hari to have pulled this off. And I would like to say that the story of Indian science and scientists and institutions and their work hasn't been told, I would like to say, in this fashion. And over such a broad canvas. There has been work, science studies, science and technology studies, but I would say this broad canvas going across so many fields, I think it's a very amazing book for that reason. So maybe Hari, I would like to, would you like to tell us about how you thought about this book and what was your idea behind?
So actually the project began very accidentally. Somebody, an agent, called me up and asked me whether I have any idea for a book. So I said yes. I didn't have an idea, but I said yes. And then I wrote down something, and it went to him. It went to publishers, and they accepted. So I had just sketched down some vague ideas about what happened after independence. I really didn't know, because I started work in 1990. So since then, what has happened the last 30 years, I knew very well, but not what happened before that. So one reason I wrote the book is for me to understand what happened. So that's always a way to, when you don't know something, if you want to, then you write about it, then in the process you learn. So that was the reason. And so it is an extraordinary discovery, and I had no idea that the conditions in which science had been built. We have political histories, we have other histories, environment history, everything, but there's no science history as such that I've seen. So primarily wrote to learn, to teach myself what happened.
Thanks, Hari. Actually, I would like to say that the chapters and the stories of people is peppered with so many details of the society, the contemporary society of those times, and the linkages, I would say, across various institutions, linkages with politics also, for that matter, right?
Little bit, a little bit, not much.
Yeah.
Not with politicians so much as Yeah.
For example, there is this bit about the NCRA, right? National Center for Radio Astronomy, which is in Pune University, which runs this giant meter wave radio telescope, GMRT, which was one of, like, I would say, an achievements of Indian science. Not as much talked about as the space program, perhaps, right?
Yeah.
I thought about this because when you write about Govind Swarup going about his own process, maybe a creative process, can we call it a creative process?
Of course.
Of institution building.
Of course.
So how did you go about, like as a journalist, as a writer, like it's almost like an investigation into what happened in the past, and what's your process like?
There is no process as such. You begin somewhere, talk to people, and you learn, and then as you learn, you start writing. It's a sort of an automatic thing. And then once you have something, you revise. There is no standard process at all. About Govind Swarup, I had heard of Govind Swarup, but I didn't know him, and I really didn't know what he did. So somebody told me that you should go and meet him. I went and did, and then 1 hour with him. Till then I was groping, what is happening. I had spent a year researching, but once I met him, everything fell into place, because he was such a unique person, and what he did was also unique. So I'll give a quick introduction to people who didn't know this. So if you look at India's 1940s or 30s, you pick an arbitrary date. Sorry. 1940. You look at a world map, you find mostly European colonies. And if you look at British colonies, there are more than 60 countries. And you see how much, you look at the science that these countries are doing. And one thing, how many Nobel Prize winners are there in these countries? You'll find only 2 in 1940. One was the discoverer of insulin in Canada. The second was C.V. Raman. And if you look at Indian science at that time, you had at least 2 more people who could have won the Nobel Prize at that time. And so Indian science was very well developed in 1947. No colony had science like this, except Canada and Australia, which were probably not colonies in the strict sense of the term. But then what happened is, after the war, a lot of money flowed into laboratories in Europe and US and Japan, and they built very sophisticated instruments. And they went ahead so quickly that Indian science was left behind. And we couldn't afford this kind of an instruments. You had X-ray crystallography. These are the areas which developed, just before Indian independence and after. So, astronomy became a big. Radio astronomy started in the 30s and became a well-developed field by end of 50s already. So quickly, and people have built so many telescopes around the world. X-ray crystallography. they were making big machines and then looking at atoms, and you could see atoms and molecules. Not see, look at the structure. Spectroscopy, spectrometry, these were the new techniques. So chemistry was based on quantum mechanics, while in India people will still doing distillation columns and things like that. So if you wanted to develop Indian science, you had to build instruments, and for which there was no money. Not just money, India did not have private industry who could give them the components. You can't import components because there's no foreign exchange. So what do we do? So it's in this context that all these scientists started working after independence. And Swaroop was in Stanford. He had a very good job, but he wanted to come back. And they all went through the independence movement and felt that science had to be built in India. So he came back. He joined TIFR. He wrote to Baba that he wanted to come back, and Baba straight away hired him. He had some equipment, whatever he asked for, they gave, but he was not satisfied because at that time, the big problem was the Big Bang theory and steady state theory, the two theories, competing theories about the origin of the universe. So everybody thought Big Bang was the correct theory. Steady state meant that nothing changed forever. It's the same thing. The universe would look always the same. But there was no proof of Big Bang. And Swaroop wanted to discover that proof. For that, he needed something, out of the ordinary. You can't, what he wanted to do was to look ahead into the universe of about 10 billion light years away. So they thought that the Big Bang happened 10 billion years ago. But now we know it's 13.7. So probably about 7 to 8 billion years away, if you look. Then you see how the galaxies looked at that time. And they looked very different and close to each other. That means the universe has expanded and evolved since then. So this was what he wanted to do. But he didn't have the telescope. So he spent 2-3 months at TIFR without doing anything. And then he was sitting in the library reading a paper in Nature, when suddenly the paper was talking about a discovery by Schmidt, who radio astronomer, who discovered quasars for the first time. He went on to win the Nobel Prize later. And another colleague of his called, I don't remember his name now, he used the moon, lunar occultation, when an object goes behind the moon and then comes out, you can use the moon edge to increase the resolution of that object. And he used this technique to look at quasars. As soon as he read the paper, Swaroop realized what he could do. Then he conceived a radio telescope, which is now in Ooty. This was in 1963. The extraordinary thing about this was it was 4 times as big as any existing telescope at that time. The biggest telescope, if I remember, is about 90 meters, 95 meters in diameter. He conceived of something that was half a kilometer long. Of course, parabolic, not half a kilometer this way, in one way. And then he thought he could build it. And he went and told Baba, and Baba said, okay, you form a team and then we'll go ahead. It was as simple as that. And there was nothing in the country. He was the only person in India who had seen a telescope, who had seen a radio telescope at that time. Nobody knew what a telescope was, how it looked like, how to build it. There was no industry who could make components, but he just like that. This is such an extraordinary act of the imagination and courage.
I feel like saying this because to think about it, to conceptualize it, and to actually make it happen, it's 2 different things. And I would say, reading your book, it feels like people like Govind Swaroop were actually able to build and nurture and train and find the right people to make this team possible. And as you have written in the book, the team itself goes on to do other things in other places, not just stays there. So those kind of ripple effects that big projects can have, like it's really amazing how.
Yeah. So the team which built Ooty built a set of antennas which for communication. And then that team went on to build the deep space network, and that ISRO now uses, in Bailaru, which is close to somewhere near Pienia.
I found it really amazing that very young people, people just fresh out of college, people who have had offers from, say, MIT, Stanford, Harvard, postponing those plans and joining these projects, and then deciding to not go and do their PhD instead in within this group while working on these projects, which is like, I would say, a very unique.
It is
action research, maybe we can call it.
So they were building something. It's not. Probably true at any time, but in those days especially, if you want to tackle a new problem, in most cases you would need to build an instrument that did not exist before. Existing instruments may not be good enough to tackle that problem. So that was what they were trying to do. It's their misfortune that when telescope was ready, somebody else had discovered the Big Bang. But he had additional proof. But if that had not happened, Kumarasamy would have been the discoverer of Big Bang, the first person to find evidence for Big Bang.
I wish to talk about the second part maybe now, or the part which involves C.N.R. Rao, of course. So you have kind of mapped out how C.N.R. Rao moved in and out of IIT Kanpur, IISc, right? And the friendships that he made, the mentoring that he got at different places, and the challenges that he faced, say, at IISc, when he came here the first time and for the second time also. So, how much do you think a person is influenced by the institution and or is affected by an institution or an institutional culture, and how much does the institutional culture change because of the people that come in, especially?
Yeah, IISc was in those days considered to be a very laid-back place. This is not fully true. IISc was doing in some places the research was very good, but by and large, you could find people very laid-back because there was no future for them. So you join as lecturer and retire as lecturer. There's no movement. You don't have money, so you can't tackle the cutting-edge problems in science that would have excited them. So it was just like an ordinary job, 9 to 6. So C.N.R. Rao came from Purdue, and he had seen the best, and he had worked. He should, use spectroscopy to look at atomic structure, molecular structure also. So when he came back, there was no spectroscopy in India, in IISc or anywhere in India. But he wanted to do something. He did not want to, do the old-fashioned chemistry. So he somehow found a way. First of all, he decided what to do. To choose his topics very carefully. If you choose a problem that is not solvable at all in India, there's no point. So he chose a problem that can be solved, but not easy. Nothing is easy anyway. So he went around, created, synthesized materials, went around, used equipment in other places, went to Aligarh, used their machine for some time, and somehow worked. But then after another 6-7 years, he realized that he cannot work there anymore. That was when IIT Kanpur started. So IIT Kanpur was a very modern place. It had more money because they had some American partnership. It was better equipped. That was really when C.N.R. began to take off. It's a new environment, new institution, and they had such outstanding people in the chemistry department, and the chemistry department became the best in the country, although it's supposed to be an engineering institution. But when he came back, by the time he came back, Satish Dhawan had taken over as a director of IIC. So Satish Dhawan changed the culture significantly. He grew the institution and started collaborations. People started working together once again. And then CNR Rao, much later, himself became the director and he changed it further. Now, the three directors who followed one after the other, Satish Dhawan, Ramasheshan, and CNR, are the people who built IIC, the current IIC. That is not to say that the others didn't do, but it was a different environment, different culture. But many people who Satish Dhawan brought were very modern in their outlook. He recruited about 70 people in 1 year. So that is how the culture changed in Institute.
Okay, so basically, the leadership that they provided to the institution, the direction that they were able to give, really mattered to changing the whole work culture and who comes there and what works gets done. I'm just wondering that as a writer, like, do you feel like there is, since we are talking about these people who are so famous and so influential, where does one say that, okay, we don't want to do hero worship, right? But we want to still recognize their contributions. So what is the line, like, where do you think?
Well, here the best way to deal with it, the way I have tried to deal with it, just say what they did and not express an opinion. Don't describe a person as brilliant or this and that. Just tell what they did, so people can understand their contributions.
What I really liked about the book is that it talks about the human angle, right? Especially the friendships and the mentoring that people get, which really helps them a lot in their work and where they go and whom they work with. So, for example, you write about Obed Siddiqui getting Satyajit Mayor, the current director of NCBS, to India to join him, going there, and this is much later, right? I mean, this is much beyond, after the Nehruvian and maybe even after the Rajiv Gandhi phase, right? Perhaps.
Yeah, it was after Rajiv Gandhi.
So what do you say about this aspect of people persuading others to kind of come and let's build something new together, that kind of...
It happens all the time. Even now it happens. But in those days it was much easier. The best example in this book is about Mashilkar, who Nayadamma, who was the Director General of CSR. So Indira Gandhi wanted to bring scientists back, the best people, because there was news that Hargobind Khurana came to India. When he got the Nobel Prize, he said he came to India, he couldn't find a job, and he went back. So this upset her, apparently. So she wanted to bring the best Indian scientists back to India and she gave a sort of a carte blanche to Nayadamma. CSR was a big organization at that time. So Nayadamma talked to Mashilkar. When he went, he gets a message from somebody whom we knew, that you meet him at 9 o'clock at this hotel. So he had no idea for what. And he had no plans to come. He was in Salford University in UK and doing extremely well. 30 minutes later, when he came out, he had accepted a job offer. So Nayadamma could make a job offer like that in those days. He had the freedom. Now it is not that easy. But then after some time he got the letter. So we still do that sometimes. Because what can be done, if it's a new area, it's much easier. If you go offer a job, then advertise for a post for this field, and that person will apply. Nobody else will apply, so he'll get the job. But in an established field, it's much harder. It's not easy to bring somebody back that easily, unless that person is motivated.
I was just wondering, going ahead, like we have had new institutions over the past 10 years, right? So many new science institutions coming up. I would say ICERs, right? The ICER systems. So or say we can talk about the new, the LIGO India project coming up now, right? The Gravitational Wave Observatory in India, which is again a biggish project, right?
Yeah.
Which will perhaps give rise to more, a new generation of scientists and engineers who would work on science. So where do you think things are going? Like, where do you think, like, now we know where we came from and what's been happening in our institutions.
Things will be difficult, continue to be difficult for a long, long time. Because India is still not a big economy. India is a lower, India's per capita income is around $2,000 or something. In real terms, it's about $6,000 or something. Lower middle income country, we are classified as. And we will not be a rich country for a very, very long time. Maybe 15, 20 years, who knows. So money will be scarce. There's no question. And we have a lot of other problems also. So how much of it will be spent on actually spent on research, we don't know. So scientists will have to improvise. And one way is to get the best is to join international projects. So LIGO is an international project. So India is a member of other international projects. SKA, the Square Kilometer Array, several thousand dishes.
So where is this coming up? Sorry.
In South Africa and Australia, a series of dishes. So after Govind Swarup built the GMRT, which is a series of 30 dishes, which is spread out over an area, do certain techniques, it gives you the equivalent diameter of a dish that big, although they are pieces. So this is the new thing in astronomy. So SKA is spread over several thousand kilometers, square kilometers. In Australia, one part in Australia, other part in South Africa. And Swarup himself was one of the first people to suggest something like this. And it has now grown to an actual project. But unfortunately, India has not yet joined officially because the money has not been sanctioned. It requires a lot of money, 1,000 crores or something. So like that, India is part of the ITER project, the fusion reactor in France. India is a partner in the 30-meter telescope, a very highly sophisticated optical telescope. So the smallest telescope India has, the largest optical telescope India has is about 2.5 meters or something. India has not built much after that. So this is a chance to use the best modern techniques and learn them and with other benefits. India's own neutrino project, if it gets underway at any point, that is another big project. So these international projects, they happen because India had a base. Without GMRT, India could not have been working on SKA. So that's the next one step forward. With smaller investment, you can work on the best problems.
I'm just, I found it really interesting that you also described the social lives of people within these institutions. Right? So how was it to interview these people, and how did you decide what you put in your book and what you don't put in, or all these?
That's a matter of personal choice also. And I like certain things, I don't like certain other things. I'd like certain things more. And somebody else who would look at the science from 47 till 2000 would probably come up with a different set of lists. And people have told me that, you chose the wrong person in this, that person is more important. But I was not going for importance. My aim, I did not write it for scientists also. This book is not meant for scientists. I would be happy if they read. And many of them have. My aim was to give a flavor of how things were from 47 to 2000 and the circumstances in which people worked and what they accomplished. So if that is the case, you can pick, and my aim also was to give an all-rounded view of science. You have the physical sciences, chemistry, and chemical engineering and biology. Physical sciences, I decided not to do physics at all, because you also have to think, what can you do? The same way that they thought. You tackle a problem that can be solved. If you tackle a problem that have to be solved, it's all great to say, but with nothing you can't solve them if you don't have the equipment. So it is much harder to write a chapter physics, because they're all scattered. In astronomy, I could pick two big projects and spend 150 pages on those two projects. So this was an opportunity. Then you can go in depth into what they really did. And so the first section is all space. Space means actually astronomy, and whatever ISRO did to enable that astronomy. And then in chemistry, there were many people. So I went by field. I chose one person who did fundamental chemistry, and a few in chemical engineering. One person who brought chemistry to the business community, taught scientists to think in terms of business. One person who was critical in India's pharma industry. And finally, one person who solved a social problem. Leather industry, which was going to shut down, how he solved it with his research. And chemistry in India was very strong. So there were so many other people who were left out. I should have been in the book, but ultimately you have limited space. So CNR, M.M. Sharma, Mashilkar, A.V. Ramarao, and then Ramasamy. Biology was sort of hurried, because by that time COVID had struck, and it was considerably short. It would have been short anyway, because biology started in 70s and 80s, and I had only about 20-25 years to cover till 2000. But it's still short.
But then you live next to NCBS.
I'm sorry?
I said you live next to NCBS,
Yeah.
so maybe that was easy.
Well, the book ended with NCBS because that was a institution in the modern sense, the 21st century institution. The parameters changed at that time. It was small, but most of them, you could know, in the 70s or 80s, you could say that we had this equipment, we were doing problems for the first time in India, and it had to be done here. Somebody had to do. So after liberalization in the 21st century, you can't say that. You have to, research is judged in international terms.
I just wonder, because you mentioned one very interesting thing. Sorry, I missed the names, but I think Bhabha got someone from Bangalore, Mr. Murthy, who was a glass blower.
Glass blower. Mm.
He got him to TIFR in Bombay. So Homi Bhabha apparently identified, what is key to research. In a way, instrumentation, having skilled people who can do their job. He's perhaps the first person that he got.
Yeah, he was considered to be a magician.
Right, right.
Glass blowing.
So, do you also plan to do something more on those lines? Because those stories, I feel, haven't been told.
There are plenty of stories to be told in Indian science, so we can only do a limited number.
There are tragedies too. For example, I would say the IISc central workshops, which were supposed to be really good till the 90s, I believe. They were shut down, and many, I would say, there are different cultures in different labs, but many labs now prefer to import stuff. You need something, you just buy it off from Germany. You have the money, anyway, it will go back if you don't spend it. So, what do you think? Is there how do we get back this? The importance for making our own instruments and having skilled people, and like you mentioned, Mr. Murthy, the magician, the glass blower who was a magician, right?
Yeah, glass blowing itself declined. Nobody does makes instruments that way anymore. Um, and instrumentation has also changed. You would know as well as anybody that modern instruments are very, very different. It's not something you can build in a shed. C.N.R. Rao built a spectrometer in a shed, getting components from Srikantan built a cloud chamber and other stuff from small things. You can't do that anymore. So you have to have an industry, private industry supplying precision components that hasn't developed yet. We don't have. So a lot of things have to be imported. It is possible to import, but it's not quite the same thing, because you don't import components and start working with them. You have to work with industry also. They have to be partners. And if they are so far away, it becomes hard. So partly it's a function of the times when instrumentation has become extremely sophisticated and expensive, depending on so many different components. And then second, I don't know what the second reason is. It's just decline. People probably don't want to do it for some reason. But there are people who still do in the old tradition. Pradeep at IIT Madras still develops a lot of instruments. And not just him. There are a few who continue the tradition.
I'm just reminded of something else, because when Hari described how people build the telescopes at GMRT, the giant this radio telescope near Pune, you described this. So basically, the idea was you have a dish and you have an array of dishes, which will be like a big telescope. But the dish itself shouldn't be too heavy. Otherwise, the structure needed to support that dish and all that is really difficult to build.
Extremely heavy.
So maybe you should describe this. what was their workaround?
So Ooty telescope, I think weighs around 200 to 250 tons. It's that big. But the structure is actually hollow. Hollow means you can see through it. And it's the wires that, very, very thin wires that cross from one end to the end that reflects the radio waves. Because the low frequency, you don't need a solid dish. GMRT was also low frequency. You didn't need a solid dish. But the design was different. UT was one huge wire. GMRT were separate dishes, and they were circular. So you need to give curvature to the dish. And how do you give curvature? It's not an easy problem when you actually start doing it. So
I'm not sure whether it's clear, but basically the dish wasn't it wasn't a solid structure. It was a mesh of wires that makes up the whole dish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you will have a backbone, a framework. But the entire thing is not solid. Wind can blow through the device, which is important because wind can exert pressure also, and then it can topple over in very high winds. But the trick is he realized what to do, how to give curvature to the dish when he saw people making baskets, and they pull with a thread, and he used the same technique.
I think that's really amazing. It's like a eureka moment, right? Almost.
Yeah.
So the problem was to give a curvature to a mesh, and the idea behind it was to actually have these wires to pull it back, so that now the way baskets are made. I found that really very visually very intriguing also. So where do we see? I just wanted, since we are here at Azim Premji University, and our university has a very social kind of a socially relevant. We want to be socially relevant. Our programs are also geared towards that. Where do you think studying about science, Indian science, the stories of scientists, institutions, the work they did, the instruments they built, the work cultures in these institutions, what do you think we as an institution can borrow from this, or even academically, if you say, like, if our students were to say read your book, um, can you, like, I would like them to read your book, but for example, more formally, something like a science and technology studies kind of a course for students, like even for students of science doing a science studies course, or even students, the master students, getting to know about these social aspects of Indian science. So where do you think it will be relevant for us? Like,
Yes, I'm sure, but I wanted to clarify one misconception, if anybody had. It was not as if everything in India during that period was great. It's not that everybody was innovative. It's everybody found a way to solve these problems, work around the lack of money, foreign exchange, everything. Only some people did. Most others were just there, doing very very ordinary science. So it is for that reason that these people stood out among a sea of mediocrity. So that is extremely important. And the institutions they built were not uniformly excellent, and they were not uniformly excellent across the period of time that the book covers. IIT Kanpur chemistry department that I mentioned, it's simply outstanding and as good as anywhere in the world. But then it declined. NCL, top-notch chemistry laboratory, declined. MBU, the department built by G.N. Ramachandran, probably India's best scientist in the last 100 years. Many people rank him above C.V. Raman. Should have got a Nobel Prize, didn't. But MBU was outstanding till the 90s, declined.
the molecular biophysics unit at IISc.
IISc, molecular biophysics. Those were the people who brought structural biology in India. Of course, it had a very high impact, because the people who worked there, did PhDs in the 80s and 90s, are now driving India's biology. But MBU itself has declined. That is declined because structural biology itself has changed, and you no longer do it the way they do. And it's not that easy for a department to reinvent itself in India. If a subject becomes unfashionable and a new thing comes up, an entire field, it is not easy for a lab. There is a lot of inertia. In 5 years, you can't change the entire laboratory and make it, completely new. So that is the reason why things decline. So in terms of studying science, science and technology studies, first of all, it's not been written. If there is a course on science and technology studies or history of science, and what do you read? There are only very few researchers even work in this area. History of science in India. There are a few, and they have written a few books, but it's not. You don't have a complete picture. And one big problem is people have not maintained records. And I had to rely a lot on interviews, except TIFR. And because TIFR has a very good archives set up by Indira Chowdhury. And she worked there for about probably 6-7 years, set up everything. It is very, very nice. But since then, it has still not been set up, since after she left. But you have oral history, long interviews. I mean, about 8-9 hours of interview with each big scientist. Swarup, M.G.K. Menon, Bhabha, not Bhabha, it started after that. Whoever was alive in the 90s and early 20th century. B.B. Srikandan. And their letters are there, post-its are there, handwritten letters are there. Even things like, where somebody has written, I'm coming, so my wife will be with me, can you find some accommodation for her? All those notes are also there. They're all part of history. It gives you an idea of how things were. But this is not true of other institutions. So if you write books on history, how do you write? It's very hard. And there is a National Archive, but getting information from there is not that simple. And if you actually come to science, the way they worked, the way they thought, the way ideas originated, None of those things have been put on record. So before we have a course, we have to create something for them to learn.
Yeah, I would say after Shiv Vishwanathan's works, I would say that your book is perhaps the most significant recent work.
Well, Shiv Vishwanathan is an academic.
Yeah.
I'm not an academic. This just describes as things were, as I saw it. Shiv Vishwanathan is also a critic. He has an opinion and he analyzes things, and writes what he thinks. But this book is not like that. This is just a description of how, as things as I found it.
It's interesting that you talk about the life cycle of institutions and departments that you just spoke about right now. Like, so does it mean that institutions? What lessons can we draw from this? Maybe institutions need to reinvent themselves, or contemplate, or retrospective, or.
So, reinventing things in the government is not easy. All institutions are part of the government. Some people have managed a new institution. People ask, why did we build all these new institutions? There were universities which were good, and they were all declined. So, at the time of independence, at least you had Madras University, Bombay University, UD City was part of Bombay University. Then Banaras Hindu University, Allahabad, Calcutta. They were all good universities. There were some more. But we started new institutions like CSR, laboratories, separated teaching from research. And over a period of time, they became the big place to do research, while the universities declined. Why did we do that? It was partly a conscious decision. And initially, Nehru and some of the people, there were two camps, Saha and Bhabha. Not individuals as such, but one camp wanted universities to be, to come up. The other camp thought that, you have to have national laboratories, institutions to do research. So, ISAS came to fill this gap later, to bring education and research together. But there must have been a reason why Bhabha did this. He may have felt the way he felt when he worked in IIC, that IIC is not the place for him. He wanted to work in a very, very modern institution. So built that himself. So people who wanted to do something in a particular way, there's no institution, you build one. Unfortunately, this had its negative impact on existing institutions. And also many of the universities were state universities with state government in control. It becomes more difficult, because it becomes very heavily politicized. Central universities at least, remained at a certain level. But to cut a long story short, it's not easy to reinvent institutions within the government setup. There are so many rules and that you have to follow.
I was just wondering because the image of science, the image of what is science or what is scientific research, which perhaps many of us get from our school textbooks or something. How do we go beyond that? Like, how do we? I'm talking from the point of view of science education.
No, but what kind of image did you mean?
The image is that questions and short answers. This is a question, and this is the answer to that question. That's the a very linear and very maybe dogmatic view of science, that it's about this every question having a neat answer, something. The messiness, the whole human angles of science.
Every important human activity is messy. In fact, there is a book called Messy, written by Tim Harford. It's good to read that. It's interesting how order comes out of messiness. What were you asking?
No, I was saying that we have this image of science, right, which is like a popular image of science, or of scientists.
So the question answer that you mentioned is just it is not there anymore, I suppose. At least not in the best institutions. That's an old system, in probably in some schools. I suppose we've gone away from all that these days. I don't know because I didn't study science in school, in college.
Yeah, I was mainly talking about schools, but because most people tend to study only schools, science in schools, right? So, no, even in the popular culture, the image of scientists, of people, mad scientists, or people who are loners, people who don't like to socialize. So, how do we get the stuff, say, out there in the public imagination, the popular kind of thing?
Read this book.
Yes, thanks.
But it's this image has been created mainly by the movies, by Hollywood. It's not has no relationship to reality.
Yes, thank you for writing the book. Yes. And are there any questions that people would like to talk?
So, with respect to whoever you've written about in your, the scientists you've written about in your book, they've kind of come up in spite of their of the situation in like the scientific area in India at the time. So, what would you say is like? Do you think like even now there's still that kind of? I mean, there's a lot of access issues when it comes to science, because science is considered to be a very elite kind of subject, and I'm kind of like an ex-scientist in a sense. Like I just got out of my MSc, so I felt it was a very academia in general is a very unwelcome place if you don't have your brains together in a sense. So like how do you we can evolve from that? Like is it about science education itself, or is it something more social? So a social kind of fabric of ours.
Of course, there is some elitism because science is difficult, and to do research at the cutting edge, you have to spend a lot of time learning things. And after if you spend 7 or 8 years learning something very, very deeply, obviously you are very different from the person who did not learn that. So that person who does not know that would think that that elitist. Probably true to a certain extent, but I am not sure it is fully true. Not all institutions are elitist, and not all scientists are also elitist. They especially these days, they are all very down-to-earth people, and then they relate to society, relate to people. They can have ordinary conversations. I don't think it is elitist, but there are some institutions where they deliberately perpetrate this view. But I think they are a minority now. Even in IITs, if you go in IIT and talk to people, you don't get that feeling.
But also there has been a big issue. I think I'm stopped now. But there also has been an issue of plagiarism, and not only plagiarism. It's more about. I believe I'm not going to name the scientist, but NCBS itself has got itself into a very recent storm of a PI forcing her PhD students and other students to get the same data, like the kind she's more into theoretical. So like she was kind of forcing them to get the same data for her thing. So like I feel like there is also this disconnect between our understanding of theoretical science and practical.
So you cannot generalize from one example.
I mean, it happens.
Scientists are human beings.
Yeah.
And you find all kinds of human beings everywhere. And plagiarism is not an Indian phenomenon. It happens everywhere. If you have 100 people, there will be one person who does things they should not be doing.
Perhaps the question remains, I feel, that how can science, or maybe science within a country like India with its diversity, be more inclusive? And be, as you use the word inviting, right? Did you use the word inviting, more inviting?
No, I said it was unwelcome.
Unwelcome, right?
That's why I
right.
kind of like left the academia.
Yeah. So
You'll always find people who we don't like. They don't like you. Either way. So scientists are also human beings. All the human failures they have. So
I think more people need to acknowledge that, because I think we tend to put our scientists on pedestal, in a sense. Like, I understand C.V. Raman is very important, but he also denied women's entry into, I think IISc, yeah. Yeah, so I
But then,
understand his
but the
contribution.
person involved had to do satyagraha for a week,
Yeah.
and then she got Kamala Soni. She got admitted.
Yeah, but C.V. Raman, nobody has said C.V. Raman was a good human being. Let me rephrase it. He was a nice person. He was not just denying entry to women. His colleagues didn't like him. He fought with everybody.
For people who sort of have watched science till the 90s, I mean, the kind of names and discoveries that you have covered in your book is absolutely fascinating. And one of the things, Hari, that I've heard is Bhabha's contribution to building TIFR. And the model that he adopted where, he just picked the person, whether it could be Obaid Siddiqui for molecular biology, it could be Professor Srikantan for cosmic ray physics, or Raghunathan in mathematics. And he just picked the right people and built the departments around them, which all went on to become outstanding departments. Is there anything that you picked up in your conversations with all these scientists about Bhabha and his style?
In fact, quite a few. He had a vision. I mean, as I said earlier, when he came to India in 1936 or 37 or something, a little later, I think 39, he came for a holiday. He had no plans to work in India. He wanted to go back to the UK. But at that time, World War broke out and he could not go back. Now he wanted to do research. He joined Indian Institute of Science and he found that was not the place he wanted to be. Then he thought he would build something where he could research, the kind of institute where he would be happy working. This is how TIFR happened. But he also seen how the best institutions that are built in Cambridge, in the UK, and the best of European laboratories. So he knew what to do. He wanted to hire the best and give them freedom, as we say it. But as a person, Bhabha was quite aloof. He did not mix freely with people. So for work he was there, but he always kept a distance other than work. This was an unusual characteristic. I mean, the other person who in space program is often compared with Sarabhai. Sarabhai was not like that. Sarabhai mixed with everybody. And Bhabha was a far better scientist, I suppose, than Sarabhai. And very organized. Sarabhai was also not apparently that organized. But he had a way of inspiring people. I don't think anybody has had, at least the people I have met, the Swaroop, Srikantan, they have had very intimate conversations with Bhabha. He was not of that type.
Good evening, sir. I actually want to ask you about what is your viewpoint on Dr. Vikram Sarabhai, because his contribution to Indian space science, and I think he's a really powerful pillar in the world of Indian space research and sciences. He has made India collaborate with different, like NASA, Germany, and then USSR. The first project, which was Nike Patch. Then he came to Rohini. Then he set up Pearls, then Turls, then Tumba. Then he went to Sriharikota. He had huge collaboration with Bhabha, and I wanted to know your viewpoint on that, on Dr. Vikram Sarabhai.
What do I think of him?
No, yeah, his contributions to Indian science. Thank you.
So he had a great vision. He thought about things that most people did not think possible. His own conception of physical research laboratory that I suppose he thought about this when he was in his 20s for the first time. that he wanted to build, have a laboratory like this. And similarly, space program. Space program, when he started, 10 years after it was started, he wanted to build geostationary satellites and to launch satellites. It was very ambitious, but it took a very, very long time. And instead of 10 years, it would take 25, 30 years for it to reach his goals. But other than that, and he's inspired people. He would go to labs in the middle of the night and then talk to people who were working there at that time. Not Baba. Baba wouldn't do that. He was not at that time. He is a different person. But he also took decisions very quickly. But I have heard that he was not very organized, a little bit of chaotic kind of person. So after he died, it was Satish Dhawan who brought order to ISRO. He was very systematic. He systematized everything, rules, procedures for everything, reviews. Open environment. If everybody could say, open environment was there even when Sarabhai was. So Dhawan continued that, and then on top of that he added new layers. A lot of what ISRO has become in space is because of Dhawan, I think, because the execution phase was during his time. Actually, his creation as such. He did not plan to develop IITs, for example. It was another set of people. There was a committee called Sakar Committee, who about 15 people. Many of these scientists were members of that. Bhatnagar was, Venkatraman was. They thought about IITs, but then Nehru would not stand in the way. He would facilitate because he liked these ideas. He thought science would come in the way. Science would is the future for India. That belief was his contribution, primarily.
This question reminds me of this famous. This question reminds me of this famous photograph of Gandhi visiting IISc. Have you seen that photo? Maybe it's not that popular, perhaps. But I remember reading something about that Gandhi had asked whether you do work which is relevant to people's lives. And this has always been this point of little bit of kind of discord, that should science always be socially relevant? Should science be for the sake of science? Or for that matter, this, what would you say about these kind of dilemmas?
So, I'm not an expert in this. I know that Gandhi and Nehru had different views on this. Nehru was modern, technology-led, higher education-led, industry-led India. Gandhi believed in rural India. So he thought that was for India's future. So that was why Gandhi must have asked whether they were working socially relevant projects. I'm not sure that was actually the case. Nobody worked on socially relevant projects in those days. Some exception, CLRI, the Leather Institute in Chennai, where the leather industry was working with CLR right from the beginning. And there it was primarily due to Naiduma, who was first director there. But other than that, there was not much of socially relevant science, at least in good numbers. But that has changed now. Now a lot of people in IITs and IISc, they all work on socially relevant problems.
Or maybe these spin-offs, right? You have spin-offs from research that maybe...
That is also a recent phenomenon in India in the last 15 years.
Ramrao and Yusuf Hamid in the book, which I think is worth recounting if just for the serendipity that happens and remarkable.
Yeah,
so could
the
you
whole
just talk about?
Yeah, the whole chapter on Ramarao is a chapter of serendipity. I don't think everybody they would know who Ramarao is. Ramarao was the person who had, sort of in many ways started this whole generics industry in India. There were Cipla and some of these Runbacks, all those companies were there. But Ramarao showed that you can take very, very complex molecules and make them in India. and at a very low cost. And once he showed, it became a sort of a movement. So the story is, when he was a young researcher, B.D. Tilak, who was the director of NCL, told all the scientists that I've got a letter from Indira Gandhi saying that all scientists should work on industrially relevant problems. The Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, that industry was missing in CSR. So NCL had very rarely transferred a technology. In fact, they had not transferred any technology to industry until then. And Indira Gandhi was asking them, after the Patent Act was changed, now there is a new act. There is no product patent, so you can actually take molecules made, drugs in the West, and make them here. But then everybody protested. Ramarao thought that it was a valid point, and he started working on diazepam, which is a sort of an antidepressant, very high value, small volume chemical. He found that it is the method actually described by the origin manufacturers is impossible in India, but it required equipment and a certain technology that India did not have, and he could never do it. But he kept working on it on his own. It was not his day job, by the way. He had another project. He was working with the PL for the Indo-American project on agriculture. During his non-office hours, which did not exist for almost everybody else, he worked on this, and in 3 months he found a way to make diazepam in a different route. He made a few milligrams. And then, because of the other project, he had to go to Bombay to find out. He was not getting the plants that he wanted on time. So he went to a trader who supplied those plants. So then the trader, after saying that, I will give you the plants, in a week or two, took him to meet Yusuf Hamid, who was now the chairman of CIPLA, and at that time he was the R&D director or something. So they kept chatting, and Hamid asked him, "What are you working on?" He said, "I'm working on diazepam." And Hamid was stunned, because Hamid was trying to make it himself and thought it was not possible. And then Hamid came to NCL and bought that technology, bought that idea, not even the technology, the idea, in just the route, the synthesis route that he wrote on a piece of paper, for which they paid 30,000 rupees. That was the first technology that NCL licensed. And then Ramarao, brought money, new technologies, so many drugs, vitamin B6, and very complicated molecules. He moved to IICT Hyderabad and converted into a huge lab, which became, the sort of bedrock of pharma industry for a long time. But now it has declined because the same story, because pharma industry has got much better facilities. They don't have to depend on a government lab for R&D.
Thank you, Hari. Thanks a lot for coming and talking with us.
You're welcome.
I hope our students read your book and our faculty read your book, and I hope the book goes places and people all over the country read about our institutions and our scientists. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming in and for staying. And again, quick request to you to mark your calendar for Fridays afternoon 2 to 3:30, 2 to 4 o'clock slot. And also, in whatever capacity you are in the Azim Premji University community, if you are part of placement team, as a student volunteer, if you are part of sustainability committee and things like that, impress upon your colleagues to make sure that Friday colloquium slot is something that remains on the calendar, and we have a good audience listening to new ideas. Do suggest names also of speakers. And thanks again for being here.